Imagine waking up to find that one Supreme Court vote just changed the future of gun laws, markets, manufacturers, and millions of American households, while the Justice Department quietly signals it's ready to walk away from a decades-long strategy. This isn't a headline. It's a turning point, and almost nobody's explaining what it really means. The Supreme Court's 6-3 ruling didn't just land like another legal update. It landed like a shockwave. Because beneath the legal language and procedural posture is something far bigger. A signal, a recalibration. A moment where the balance between federal power, constitutional interpretation, and political enforcement quietly but decisively shifted. And if you think this is only about firearms, you're already missing the real story. What makes this moment different is not just who won or lost in court, it's how the ruling fits into a larger pattern that's been building for years. The court didn't issue a sweeping manifesto. It didn't ban anything outright. Instead, it did something far more consequential. It reinforced a framework that makes broad assault weapon bans legally fragile, increasingly expensive to defend, and politically risky to enforce. And almost immediately, the Department of Justice began signaling that it sees the writing on the wall. Here's why that matters. For decades, the strategy around assault weapon bans relied on momentum. Pass a law, defend it aggressively, let lower courts argue it out, delay long enough and hope the Supreme Court never steps in. That strategy worked for a long time, but this ruling changes the cost-benefit calculation. The court yes current majority has made it clear that modern gun restrictions must pass a historical test, not an emotional one, not a polling test, and not a public safety narrative alone. And that single standard is now reshaping everything. The 6-3 split itself tells you something important. This wasn't a fractured court unsure of its direction. This was a disciplined majority reinforcing precedent. That precedent says if a firearm is in common use by law-abiding citizens, broad bans face an uphill battle. Not because the court is endorsing a lifestyle or a culture war, but because constitutional analysis doesn't bend easily to modern political pressure. That's the part most headlines avoid saying out loud. Now layer in the DOJ's response. When federal prosecutors start using words like reassessment, prioritization, and resource allocation, those aren't neutral phrases. In Washington, that's code. It means enforcement enthusiasm is cooling. It means defending certain bans all the way to the Supreme Court may no longer be viewed as a winning investment. And it means states pushing aggressive restrictions may soon find themselves standing alone without the federal backstop they once assumed was guaranteed. This is where the financial and strategic implications start to matter. Firearms manufacturers, retailers, insurers, and even municipal pension funds exposed to litigation risk all pay attention to Supreme Court signals. A ruling like this doesn't just influence future cases. It changes behavior today. Companies delay relocations, states rethink timelines, advocacy groups redirect funding, and investors quietly reprice risk. But here's the most underappreciated angle. This ruling doesn't close the gun debate. It narrows it. It forces lawmakers to be more precise, more historically grounded, and far more careful. Blanket bans become liabilities. Symbolic legislation becomes dangerous. And that shift doesn't just affect gun policy. It affects how any constitutional right will be regulated going forward. We're watching a subtle transfer of leverage, away from federal agencies that once assumed courts would defer, toward a judiciary that is increasingly comfortable saying no. And when the DOJ signals alignment with that reality, even quietly, it's not retreat, it's adaptation. This is why the 6-3 ruling matters more than the sound bites. It's not about one law, it's about the rules of the game changing mid-play. And once that happens, everyone has to adjust, starting now. Imagine what this means on the ground for ordinary Americans, manufacturers, and lawmakers. Suddenly, a law that once seemed untouchable feels fragile. Imagine a state pouring millions into enforcing an assault weapon ban, only to face lawsuits that now carry a much higher chance of success. That's not hypothetical. It's happening in real time. The court's logic doesn't just apply to one case. It creates a blueprint that can be cited again and again. And when a federal agency signals it won't push back as hard, that blueprint becomes even more potent. Think about the ripple effects. Retailers who once hesitated over stocking certain firearms are now revisiting inventory decisions. Manufacturers are recalculating legal risk and potential market expansion. Investors, analysts, and even private equity funds pay attention to these subtle shifts because litigation risk is no longer a distant cloud. It's quantifiable. Suddenly, what seemed like a niche legal debate has real dollars attached to it, affecting supply chains, insurance costs, and even shareholder confidence. But there's also a political dimension that can't be ignored. Lawmakers at the state level are watching closely. Those considering aggressive gun restrictions must weigh whether they have the judicial backing to defend them. In many cases, political calculations are now intersecting with constitutional reality. Bills that could have passed easily in one legislative session might now stall, face modifications, or never see the light of day. It's a strategic chessboard where the Supreme Court has just moved a piece and everyone else is reacting. And here's a nuance often overlooked: public perception. The DOJ's signaling isn't just internal. Analysts, advocacy groups, and media outlets interpret these cues, shaping public discourse. When enforcement appears less aggressive, opponents of restrictive laws see an opportunity, and supporters reassess priorities. In essence, the court sets the legal framework, the DOJ signals enforcement priorities, and the market, politicians, and citizens adjust almost immediately. This trifecta creates a feedback loop few outside the legal and financial spheres fully grasp. We also need to consider long-term implications. History shows that Supreme Court rulings don't just settle a case, they influence decades of policy. Future legislation, litigation strategies, and advocacy approaches are all recalibrated based on the precedent set today. What looks like a narrow ruling now can define the boundaries of federal and state power for years. That's why investors, political strategists, and even local officials pay close attention. Every decision now carries layers of future consequences. And while we're talking consequences, let's not forget the human dimension. Millions of Americans own firearms, many legally, many responsibly. For them, this ruling doesn't just affect laws, it affects livelihoods, hobbies, and sense of security. It affects who they trust, how they interact with the law, and even their confidence in institutions. Laws aren't just words on paper, they're lived experiences. And when the court redefines enforcement parameters, those experiences shift almost overnight. At the same time, this ruling subtly reshapes the national conversation about rights versus regulation. The narrative is shifting from emotional debates to constitutional precision. Legislators and activists can no longer rely solely on rhetoric. They must build arguments grounded in legal precedent. That recalibration may feel subtle, but it changes how political campaigns are run, how policy is debated, and how media narratives are framed. Finally, we can't ignore the signaling effect beyond guns. Every federal enforcement policy now comes under a microscope. The DOJ-AS willingness to recalibrate in light of Supreme Court guidance sends a message to other agencies. It's a reminder that legal realities are not optional. They shape strategy, enforcement, and ultimately public policy. In other words, the ripple from this ruling isn't cheese, confined to firearms. It has a blueprint for how federal priorities can shift when the judiciary draws a line. Line drawn by the court today doesn't just mark a boundary for gun laws. It signals a broader recalibration of federal authority, enforcement priorities, and the very way constitutional limits are interpreted in real time. States, agencies, and corporations now operate with a new level of uncertainty, but also a new clarity. Certain assumptions about automatic federal support or judicial deference no longer hold. That's a seismic shift. For states pushing aggressive assault weapon bans, the ruling essentially says, if you want to enforce broad restrictions, you need airtight historical and legal justification. Otherwise, expect costly legal battles and potential reversal. And those battles are not abstract. They tie up state resources, drain political capital, and create uncertainty for law-abiding citizens who suddenly find themselves caught in an unclear regulatory web. This is why some states are already reconsidering the timing and scope of proposed legislation. They can't afford a fight they're likely to lose. Meanwhile, at the federal level, the DOJ's pivot is equally telling. By signaling it will reassess priorities, the department effectively shifts risk back to states and interest groups. Enforcement discretion isn't just bureaucratic, it's strategic. Agencies have finite resources, and the DOJ's new posture implies that certain laws may no longer be actively defended, at least not with the vigor seen in previous decades. That has ripple effects for advocacy groups, legal strategists, and private actors who now have to adjust expectations and tactics.